The dream was simple. It was sold to me in brochures and on lifestyle blogs, whispered to me by my parents, and screamed at me by the real estate market. The dream was a patch of green earth to call my own, a deck that I could stain any color I damn well pleased, as long as it was one of 3 pre-approved shades of beige, and the divine right to grill meat over an open flame on a Saturday afternoon. And for about 15 glorious minutes, I had it. The sun was perfect, one of those early summer days where it warms your skin without trying to cook you. A cold beer was sweating onto a coaster beside me. On the grill, 2 thick-cut ribeyes sizzled, releasing a scent that should be classified as a national treasure. My goofy golden retriever, Barley, was sprawled out on the grass, occasionally thumping his tail against the ground in a lazy, contented rhythm. This was it. The pinnacle. I had escaped my shoebox apartment in the city, with its perpetually angry radiator and neighbors who communicated exclusively by slamming doors. I was a homeowner, a man of the land, a king in his castle, lord of a 0.18-acre kingdom. Then, a voice cut through the air, sharp enough to pop a balloon. "Is that charcoal?" I froze, tongs hovering over a steak. The voice had come from over my left shoulder, from the adjacent property, a land ruled by a fearsome monarch named Carol Peterson. I turned slowly. There she was. Standing on her immaculate stone patio, her hands on her hips. Her perfectly coiffed platinum blonde hair was sprayed into a shape that defied both gravity and common sense, a sort of aerodynamic helmet that probably gave her an extra 5 miles per gallon on the highway. In the crook of her arm was a tiny, quivering creature that might have been a dog, but looked more like a dust bunny with anxiety issues. Yeah," I said, offering a neighborly smile that felt like it was cracking my face. "It's a Weber grill. The classic." Carol's lips pursed into a thin line, as if she'd just tasted something sour. "I'm aware of the brand, Alex. I'm referring to the fuel source. You know the particle drift can affect my prize-winning petunias, don't you?" Particle drift. My brain stalled for a second, trying to process the phrase. "Lady, it's a backyard barbecue, not a science experiment gone wrong." I half expected her to pull out a Geiger counter. "I don't think it travels that far," I offered lamely. "It's the principle of the thing," she sniffed. The dog in her arms, which I knew from a previous, equally painful interaction was named Sir Reginald Fluffington, emitted a high-pitched yip of agreement. This was my life now. For the past 2 months, since I'd moved into what I thought was my peaceful suburban haven, Carol had been the self-appointed narrator of my every action. My lawn, apparently, was mowed in a sub-optimal crosshatch pattern. My taste in classic rock, played at a volume barely audible to human ears, was disruptive to the neighborhood's auditory feng shui. She once left a pamphlet on my doorstep about composting because she saw me throw a banana peel in the trash can. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was an invasive species. The core of the problem was the layout of our properties. There was no fence, not even a sad little line of shrubs. My deck was a stage, and her patio was the front row seat. I couldn't so much as sip my morning coffee without feeling her judgmental gaze boring into the back of my skull. "Well, the wind's blowing the other way, Carol," I said, trying to end the conversation by turning back to my grill. "The petunias should be safe." "For now," she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. She then scanned my yard, her eyes narrowing. "And you really should do something about Barley's digging. A single hole can compromise the foundational integrity of the topsoil. It invites grubs." I looked over at Barley, who had just managed to get 1/3 of a tennis ball lodged in his mouth and looked immensely proud of himself. The hole he'd dug was less a hole and more a minor divot, the kind of thing a heavy rainstorm would fix on its own. That was it. That was the final straw. It wasn't the grilling or the music or the compost shaming. It was the attack on my dog. My happy, stupid, hole-digging dog. You can insult my lawn, you can insult my taste in music, but you do not insult my dog. That night, after eating a steak that tasted vaguely of resentment, I sat at my computer. The glow of the screen illuminated my determined face. I wasn't a confrontational person by nature. My entire career as a software developer was based on solving problems logically and quietly. But this was a problem that code couldn't fix. This required something more structural. I typed into the search bar, how to build a privacy fence. I needed a wall. I didn't just want a fence, I needed it. I needed a 6-foot-tall wooden barrier between my life and Carol's ceaseless commentary. It was a matter of survival. My sanity depended on creating a vertical plane of wood that would block her, Sir Reginald, and her opinions about particle drift from my line of sight forever. How hard could it be? In my naivete, I believed the path to privacy would be paved with logic and reason. I imagined a world where a man could simply decide to build a fence on his own property and, do it. I had forgotten about the shadowy cabal that held true power in this neighborhood, a force more binding than the laws of physics and more arbitrary than the whims of a toddler, the Meadow Creek Farms Homeowners Association. My first step was to consult the holy text, a 3-ring binder thick enough to stop a bullet filled with the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The prose was dense, a dizzying whirlwind of legalese that seemed designed to induce headaches. But I was a man on a mission. I found the section on boundary modifications. With the grim determination of someone defusing a bomb, I drafted my request. I was polite. I was professional. I downloaded Form 7B, Application for Exterior Alteration. I filled it out using the officially sanctioned font, Times New Roman, size 12. I detailed my plan for a simple, tasteful, 6-foot cedar privacy fence. I included a diagram drawn to scale, showing its precise location along the property line. I even attached a photo of the proposed materials. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ass-kissing. I mailed it in, full of the foolish optimism of the uninitiated. Exactly 1 week later, a letter arrived. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper used for wedding invitations or declarations of war. Dear Mr. Miller, it began, the Architectural Review Committee has received and reviewed your application for a boundary fence. While we appreciate your commitment to improving your property, your request has been denied. Denied? I reread the sentence. Then I read it again. There was no explanation, no reason given, just a flat, soul-crushing rejection. At the bottom, it cited a bylaw, Article 4, Section 3, C. I scrambled back to the binder, my heart pounding with a rising sense of dread. I flipped through the pages, the paper crinkling angrily under my fingers. And there it was, a single sentence nestled between rules about satellite dish placement and acceptable mailbox colors. No boundary fence or wall shall exceed a height of 4 feet from established grade. 4 feet? 4 feet. What was the point of a 4-foot fence? It was a decorative suggestion, not a barrier. It was a fence for garden gnomes. Barley could clear a 4-foot fence without a running start. Carol, at 5'3", would be able to rest her chin on it and deliver her critiques with even greater ease. It was functionally useless. Furious, I decided to appeal my case in person. The HOA held its monthly meetings in the garage of its president, a retired electrical engineer named Bob. Bob was a man who wore his authority like he wore his crisp, white New Balance sneakers, proudly and without a hint of irony. When I arrived, The garage was already filled with the ambient scent of fertilizer and self-importance. Bob sat at a folding table at the front, flanked by 2 other board members. And sitting in the front row of folding chairs, looking as smug as a cat in a creamery, was Carol. Of course. I made my case. I spoke of privacy, of the basic human need to not be observed while attempting to flip a burger. I spoke of my dog and his need for a secure area to play. I was calm, I was rational, I was everything they claimed to be. Bob listened, steepling his fingers. "Alex, we appreciate your passion," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But the rules are the rules. They were established in 1988 for a reason." "And what reason is that?" I asked, my voice tighter than I wanted. "To maintain the aesthetic harmony of the community," he replied, as if he were reciting a sacred oath. "Tall fences create a fortress-like atmosphere. They're unfriendly. They discourage neighborly interaction." I glanced at Carol, who was now nodding so vigorously her helmet hair was in danger of achieving liftoff. "Neighborly interaction is the whole problem," I nearly shouted. "My neighbor is overly interactive." Carol gasped, placing a hand on her chest as if I'd just accused her of treason. "I have only ever tried to be helpful," she said to the room. "Some people are just resistant to constructive feedback." The 2 other board members murmured their agreement. I was being outmaneuvered. It was a kangaroo court in a 2-car garage. "Look," I pleaded, making one last attempt. "Just give me a logical reason why a 6-foot fence is a problem, but a 4-foot fence is fine." Bob leaned back in his chair, a look of profound pity on his face. "Son," he said, the word landing like a slap, "it's not about logic, it's about the bylaws." I left the meeting, my blood boiling. As I walked down Bob's driveway, the automatic garage door closing behind me like the gates of hell, I saw Carol standing by her perfectly manicured mailbox. She gave me a tiny, triumphant little wave. It was in that moment that my simple quest for privacy curdled into something else. This was no longer about a fence. This was about justice. This was about freedom. This was about the inalienable right to live one's life without unsolicited advice on topsoil integrity. The war had been declared, and I had just lost the first battle. But I was a software developer. If I couldn't find a solution, I'd find a loophole, and I would exploit the hell out of it. The next few days were bleak. I wandered around my house like a ghost, occasionally staring out the back window at the vast, fenceless expanse that separated my yard from Carol's. Each time I saw her out there, deadheading her petunias, or walking Sir Reginald in a tiny, pointless circle, a fresh wave of despair washed over me. I brainstormed a list of increasingly unhinged solutions. Build a 4-foot fence, and then on top of it, build a 2-foot-tall planter box filled with the thorniest plants known to man, probably a violation of Section 8.d, appurtenances and attachments. Buy a series of enormous, strategically placed patio umbrellas. Create a sort of fabric-based circus tent over my entire yard. Likely violates rules on temporary structures. Train a flock of pigeons to swarm Carol whenever she steps onto her patio. Probably illegal. Definitely messy. Give up and move. The coward's way out. And I just unpacked. I called my best friend Dave to vent. Dave is a high school history teacher with a flair for the dramatic and a deep-seated hatred for any form of bureaucracy. "You're thinking too small, man," he said after I explained the situation. "This is your moment. This is your Boston Tea Party. You need to make a statement." "What kind of statement?" I asked. "Building a 6-foot fence anyway and daring them to find me?" "No, that's what they expect. You need to think outside the box. Get a bunch of those giant inflatable tube men they have at car dealerships and line the property line. Let them dance for freedom." "Dave, I'm not sure that's in the spirit of aesthetic harmony." "Exactly. Fight absurdity with absurdity. While the image of a dozen flailing tube men giving Carol an aneurysm was tempting, I needed something more permanent, more elegant. That night, unable to sleep, I found myself where all desperate people go for answers, the internet. Fueled by a tumbler of cheap whiskey and a burning sense of injustice, I typed HOA horror stories into Google. It was a revelation. I wasn't alone. There were thousands of us, a silent army of homeowners trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare of beige paint and lawn height regulations. I scrolled for hours, reading tales of woe and petty tyranny. Then, I stumbled upon a subreddit. It was called r Malicious Compliance. It was a digital monument to sticking it to the man, a collection of stories about people following rules to the absolute letter, with delightfully disastrous results for their oppressors. I read about an office worker who, when told he had to document every single task, started logging things like typed the letter T and inhaled, then exhaled, crashing the company's server with his reports. I read about a soldier ordered to paint a room who, when not given any masking tape, painted the walls, windows, outlets, and light switches with painstaking precision. And then I saw it. A post from a user in Florida. His HOA had a rule similar to mine, no fences over 4 feet. But their bylaws, like mine, were hyper-specific about man-made structures. They said nothing about plants. So he had planted a living fence. A dense wall of areca palms that grew 15 feet tall. A jolt went through me, clearing the whiskey fog from my brain. I frantically pulled up my HOA's digital covenant file. I searched for keywords: plant, tree, shrub, hedge, landscaping. The rules were shockingly vague. There were guidelines about keeping things trimmed and not planting known noxious weeds, but there were no height restrictions. Not a single one. The bylaws were obsessed with the works of man. Fences, walls, sheds, gazebos, but the works of nature had seemingly slipped right past them. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Fastest-growing privacy hedge, tall screening plants. The results poured in. Leyland cypress, thuja green giant, and then bamboo. It was perfect. Some species grew ridiculously fast, several inches a day in the right conditions. They formed a dense, impenetrable screen. And most importantly, from a legal standpoint, bamboo isn't a tree or a shrub, it's a member of the grass family. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. I could almost hear the gears turning in Bob's head as he tried to argue that my grass was too tall. I did some more research, finding a clumping variety called Golden Goddess that was non-invasive. I wasn't trying to unleash a bamboo plague on the entire state. I was a malicious complier, not a monster. At 3 a.m., my living room was lit only by the glow of a single web page. It was the checkout page for a bulk order of 2-gallon Golden Goddess bamboo rhizomes. Enough for a 50-foot-long double-row installation. My finger hovered over the Complete Purchase button. This was it. The point of no return. This was an act of horticultural warfare. They didn't want a 6-foot fence? Fine. They're getting a 20-foot wall of grass. Let's see them find a bylaw for that. I clicked the button. The battle for Meadow Creek Farms had begun. The email confirmation for my purchase of what felt like half of Southeast Asia's bamboo supply was both thrilling and terrifying. I was a software guy. My experience with plants involved occasionally remembering to water the sad-looking succulent on my desk. I couldn't build a 20-foot-tall biological wall by myself. I needed a professional. I needed a mercenary. I found him on a local business review site under landscaping and hardscaping. His company was called Sal's Earth and Stone, and his slogan was, "We dig it." His profile picture showed a grizzled, sun-weathered man in his late 50s, with a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, and a look in his eyes that said he'd seen things. He looked less like a landscaper and more like a guy who could get you a new identity in a hurry. He was perfect. I called him. His voice was gravelly, like he gargled with pebbles. I explained, cautiously at first, that I wanted to install a privacy hedge. "What kind?" he grunted. "Bamboo," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The running kind or the clumping kind?" "Clumping, the non-invasive type." Another pause. "Okay, kid, you passed the first test. Where you at?" Sal came by the next afternoon. He rolled up in a beat-up Ford F-250 that looked like it had personally survived a Mad Max movie. He surveyed my yard, then looked over at Carol's patio where she was, I kid you not, measuring the height of her bird bath with a tape measure. Sal took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Let me guess," he said, not taking his eyes off her. "HOA trouble." "Is it that obvious?" "Kid, I've been doing this for 30 years. 90% of my business is what I call conflict landscaping. People want bigger trees, thornier bushes, and spite fences. So, what's the story?" I laid out the whole saga for him. The charcoal, the dog, the 4-foot fence rule, Bob's garage court, the late-night Reddit discovery. As I spoke, a slow grin spread across Sal's leathery face. By the time I finished, he was chuckling, a low, rumbling sound like rocks in a tumbler. "A 20-foot wall of grass," he mused, tapping his cigarette ash onto my lawn without a care in the world. "That's beautiful, man. That's poetry." He looked at me with a newfound respect. "You want to build a spite fence." "I prefer the term privacy hedge with extreme prejudice," I corrected. "I like it." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that nearly sent me sprawling. "Kid, I once built a 3-tiered waterfall with stadium-grade pumps for a guy because his neighbor hated the sound of running water. This is Tuesday for me. We can do this." Sal became my general, my strategist. He wasn't just a landscaper. He was an artist whose medium was passive aggression. He advised a double-row offset planting pattern for maximum density. He insisted on digging a deep trench and installing a thick, plastic root barrier. Just in case this stuff gets any ideas. He said it with a wink, but I appreciated the professionalism. He calculated the exact amount of composted manure we'd need to give the bamboo an aggressive start. 2 days later, the operation began. A dump truck arrived at 7:30 a.m. and deposited a mountain of dark, rich soil on my driveway. An hour later, Sal's crew, a team of 2 silent, incredibly efficient guys named Marco and Luis, showed up. Then came the flatbed truck with 50 pots of golden goddess bamboo. Each plant was already a respectable 4 feet tall, a bundle of slender green canes and feathery leaves. Carol was on her patio instantly, clutching Sir Reginald like a furry, trembling shield. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated suspicion. As Marco and Luis started digging the long, deep trench that perfectly traced my property line, her phone came out. She was taking pictures, documenting the first shots fired in the Great Bamboo War. Other neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the commotion. They'd wander by, slowing their morning walks to stare at the mountain of soil and the small army assembling in my yard. I gave them all a friendly, non-committal wave, as if installing a massive biological barrier was the most normal thing in the world. Sal directed the whole operation with the quiet confidence of a seasoned field commander. He'd point, grunt, and his men would execute the maneuver flawlessly. They worked all day, digging, mixing in the compost, installing the root barrier, and finally placing each bamboo plant into its new home. By the end of the first day, the trench was filled with a neat row of green shoots, a hopeful-looking but entirely transparent line of shrubbery. At the end of the second day, the job was done. The mountain of soil was gone, replaced by a neat, 2-foot-wide bed of dark mulch from which the bamboo sprouted. A sophisticated drip irrigation system was installed and buried, ready to deliver the life-giving water this green army would need for its rapid advance. Sal wiped his hands on a rag, a deeply satisfied look on his face. "There you go, kid. Your wall is planted. Just add water and wait for the screaming to start." He handed me the invoice. The project had cost a significant chunk of my savings. I looked at the innocent-looking green shoots, then over at Carol's house, where the blinds in her kitchen window were twitching. It was worth every single penny. The screaming didn't start immediately. It began as a low hum of indignation that quickly escalated into a full-blown, bureaucratic assault. The mulch had barely settled before the first email from the HOA landed in my inbox. It was from Bob himself. Subject: Unauthorized landscaping modification. Dear Mr. Miller, it has come to the attention of the Architectural Review Committee that a significant and unapproved landscaping modification has taken place at your property. Please be advised that per Article 6, Section 2, any alteration to the visual landscape requires prior written approval from the committee. Please submit a retrospective application, Form 11C, detailing the nature of these plantings immediately. Carol had clearly wasted no time. I could picture her hitting send on her complaint email with the triumphant fury of a Bond villain launching a nuclear missile. But I was ready. I had spent the night before the installation rereading the bylaws, highlighting sections, and preparing my defense. I channeled my inner corporate drone and drafted a reply. Subject: Unauthorized landscaping modification. Dear Bob, thank you for your email. I believe there may be a misunderstanding. Article 6, Section 2, to which you refer, specifically governs the installation of permanent structures, hardscaping, and major topographical changes. The work completed at my property involved the planting of horticultural specimens, specifically of the Poaceae family grass, which is governed by Article 8, lot and lawn maintenance. Per my reading of Article 8, I am in full compliance with my duty to maintain a verdant and thriving green space. No application is required for simple planting. Please let me know if you require the scientific name of the specific cultivar for your records. Best, Alex. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Using the phrase Poaceae family grass was a stroke of genius. It was technically correct and maximally annoying. The ball was in their court. While the HOA board was busy dusting off their dictionaries, the bamboo was busy doing what bamboo does best, growing. The speed was honestly a little terrifying. Sal wasn't kidding. After the first week, the shoots had visibly thickened and pushed up a few inches. After a month, the tallest canes were easily brushing 6 feet. I would go out in the morning, and they'd be noticeably taller than when I went to bed. It was like watching a time-lapse video in real life. The visual transformation was stunning. What started as a sad-looking line of sticks was rapidly becoming a dense, vibrant screen. The feathery leaves swayed in the breeze, creating a soft, rustling sound that was infinitely more pleasant than the sound of Carol's voice. Her complaints, meanwhile, were escalating in both frequency and absurdity. She sent another email to the HOA, which they dutifully forwarded to me. This one was a work of art. The so-called grass planted by Mr. Miller is creating an unnatural shadow that falls upon my patio between the hours of 4 p.m. and 6 p.m., she wrote. This is prime sunning time for Sir Reginald and is causing him significant emotional distress. Furthermore, the height of this planting is beginning to block my view of the sunset, which I believe is a violation of my right to enjoyment of property. I received an official Notice of Potential Violation for Light and View Obstruction. My reply was swift. Dear Bob, Regarding the notice for light and view obstruction, I was unable to find any mention of sunbeam access rights or sunset viewing corridors in the bylaws. If you can direct me to the specific article and section that guarantees sunlight for dogs or unimpeded sunset views, I will of course take immediate action. Sincerely, Alex. This began what I would later refer to as the Great Paper War of Meadow Creek Farms. At least once a week, I'd get a notice. Violation: improper horticultural setback from property line. I sent them a copy of my property survey showing the plants were a full foot inside my line. Violation: potential to attract unwanted wildlife. I replied that my bird feeder was more likely to do that, and it was an HOA-approved design. Violation: excessive water usage for non-essential planting. I pointed out that their bylaws had no rules on water consumption. I bought a new binder and a 3-hole punch. I printed out every email, every notice, and every one of my meticulously crafted responses. I labeled the binder The Carroll Chronicles. It was getting thick. Meanwhile, the wall kept growing. 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet. It was no longer a hedge. It was a bona fide wall of green. I could sit on my deck in complete and total privacy. The rustling of the leaves drowned out any noise from Carol's yard. The particle drift from my charcoal grill was safely contained. I had won. Or so I thought. The bamboo had reached a majestic 15 feet in height. It was a solid, impenetrable curtain of emerald green that swayed elegantly in the summer breeze. My backyard had been transformed from a stage into a sanctuary. I was in my newly private paradise, flipping burgers on the grill, a cold beer in hand. Barley was chasing a frisbee. The world was, for the first time in months, blissfully silent. The silence was shattered by a scream. It wasn't a scream of terror, but one of pure, unadulterated rage. It was Carol. "I know you're in there, Alex Miller," she shrieked. Her voice, muffled by thousands of bamboo leaves, sounded tinny and distant, like a radio broadcast from a hostile planet. Your grass is encroaching on my emotional airspace." I froze, burger patty dangling from my spatula. Emotional airspace? Was that even a thing? I decided the best course of action was to ignore her. That, I soon learned, was a tactical error. A few minutes later, I heard another sound. A siren. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. I peeked through a thin spot in the bamboo wall. A police car, its lights flashing silently, was pulling up to the curb right in front of my house. Carol was standing on her lawn, pointing dramatically towards my property, as if she'd just identified the location of a fugitive. She had actually done it. The crazy woman had actually called the cops on my plants. My heart hammered in my chest. This was a level of escalation I hadn't anticipated. I quickly turned off the grill and went to the front door, my mind racing. What do I say? Is it illegal to have tall grass? Did I accidentally buy a controlled substance species of bamboo? 2 officers were walking up my driveway. One was a young guy, probably fresh out of the academy, with a serious, eager look on his face. The other was older, probably in his late 40s, with a mustache and a world-weary sigh baked into his posture. He looked like he'd seen every stupid thing a human being could possibly do, and was just waiting for retirement. I opened the door before they could knock. "Afternoon, officers. Something I can help you with?" I said, trying to sound as casual as a man whose neighbor just called the police on his garden. The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, a fact I found grimly amusing, spoke first. "Sir, are you Alex Miller?" "I am." He glanced at his notepad. "We received a call. A dispatch for a disturbance." He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "The complainant, a Miss Carol Peterson, your neighbor, alleges that you have erected a hostile and menacing structure that is causing a public nuisance. The younger officer, whose name tag said rookie in my head, peered over my shoulder, trying to see into my backyard. Is there some kind of structure back there, sir? I had to stop myself from laughing. Officers, what I have is a hedge. It's bamboo. Would you like to see it? They exchanged a look. I guess we should, Officer Miller sighed. I led them through the side gate into my backyard. They stopped and just stared. The bamboo wall towered over us, its leaves rustling gently. It was, in its own way, magnificent. So, that's it? Officer Miller asked, gesturing at the wall with his notepad. That's the hostile structure? That's it, I confirmed. It's Golden Goddess bamboo, non-invasive clumping variety. The rookie officer looked genuinely confused. But it's just plants. Is this stuff legal? Officer Miller shot him a tired look. Son, we're in America. It's a plant. Unless he's growing it to make tiny bamboo spears and launching them at her poodle, it's a civil matter. He turned back to me. Sir, I'm going to be honest with you. This is the third time we've been called to this street this month for what turned out to be an HOA dispute. Carol had apparently chosen this moment to march over to the property line. She couldn't see us, but she could hear us. Officers, she yelled through the leaves. That thing is a blight. It's a violation. It's un-American. Officer Miller pinched the bridge of his nose, the very picture of a man at the end of his rope. He walked over to the bamboo wall and raised his voice. Ma'am, this is a civil dispute over landscaping. It is not a police matter. Please stop calling 911 unless there is an actual emergency. He turned to me, a glint of what might have been amusement in his eyes. You have a good afternoon, sir. Try to keep your grass from menacing anyone else. As they walked away, I heard the rookie whisper to him, So we can't do anything? And I heard Officer Miller's clear reply as they reached the gate. Nope, and between you and me, I kind of like it. My brother-in-law's on his HOA board. Can't stand him. They left. It was a massive, unequivocal victory. I hadn't just won. I'd won with the law on my side. I had successfully wasted police time over a gardening dispute, and the police had sided with me. I walked back to my grill, a wide grin on my face. Through the bamboo, I could hear Carol muttering to herself. Defeated. The battle was won, but I had a feeling the HOA was about to bring out their heavy artillery. My victory with the police department did not, as I had hoped, cause Carol and the HOA to retreat and reconsider their life choices. Instead, it was like kicking a hornet's nest. My public vindication had been a public humiliation for them, and they were not about to let it stand. A few days later, a stark white envelope appeared, taped to my front door. It wasn't a violation notice. It was a summons. Official notice of emergency meeting. Agenda to discuss horticultural harmony and community aesthetic standards. It was scheduled for the following Wednesday night at the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that was usually reserved for children's birthday parties and sad potlucks. This wasn't a meeting. It was a trial. My trial. The horticultural harmony part was laughable. This was about putting me in my place, publicly. I spent the next few days preparing my case. I went through the Carroll Chronicles, my binder of correspondence, and tabbed every relevant section. I printed out copies of the key bylaws. I even prepared a short, calm, and devastatingly logical opening statement. I was going into that clubhouse armed with facts and their own stupid rules. Wednesday night arrived. The clubhouse was packed. It seemed the entire neighborhood had turned out for the spectacle. I saw faces I recognized from my walks, people I'd nodded to, people who had watched the bamboo's growth with quiet curiosity. They were all here to see the show. The HOA board, Bob and his 2 lieutenants, sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking grim and important. Carol was in the front row, clutching a folder of her own. She looked like a prosecutor ready to deliver her closing argument. Bob banged a small gavel on the table. "This emergency meeting of the Meadow Creek Farms HOA is now in session," he announced, his voice booming artificially in the small room. "We are here to discuss a serious issue that threatens the very fabric of our community's aesthetic." He launched into a dramatic monologue about harmony, property values, and the spirit of cooperation. Then he turned the floor over to Carol. She stood up and delivered a presentation that would have made a conspiracy theorist proud. She had a slideshow, a literal slideshow. There were photos of the bamboo taken from her upstairs window, with ominous red circles drawn around the bamboo. There were slides with bullet points claiming the bamboo was a fire hazard, a haven for vermin, and a potential source of structural root damage to her foundation. She ended with a tearful plea about her blocked sunset. When she finished, a smattering of applause came from her corner of the room. Bob nodded gravely. "Thank you, Carol, for that powerful testimony. Now, we will hear from Mr. Miller." All eyes turned to me. I walked to the front of the room, placed my binder on the table, and took a deep breath. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady. "I understand there's a lot of concern about my grass, and I want to address it, but I want to address it using the only thing that matters in this situation, the official bylaws of this association, which we all agreed to." I opened my binder. "Carol, you mentioned my bamboo might be a fire hazard. According to Appendix C, approved fire-resistant plantings, several species of bamboo are actually recommended for creating defensive greenbelts." I held up the printed page. "You mentioned it attracts vermin. According to Article 9, Section 4, homeowners are responsible for pest control on their own property. I have seen no evidence of vermin. You mentioned root damage. My contractor installed an 80 mil thick HDPE root barrier, exceeding all industry standards for containment." I went on, point by point, calmly and methodically dismantling her entire argument with their own rulebook. I had a counter-citation for everything. Then, I went on the offensive. "The board has sent me 7 violation notices in 2 months, all of which were found to be without merit. The stated purpose of the HOA is to preserve and enhance property values. But it seems to me its current function is to harass a resident for planting a garden that is fully compliant with the written rules, simply because one neighbor doesn't like it." A murmur went through the crowd. I could see people nodding. Then, a man in the back of the room stood up. "He's got a point," the man said. "Last spring, Bob's committee sent me 3 letters because my basketball hoop was aesthetically displeasing. My kids use that hoop every day." An older woman stood up. "And I got a fine because my granddaughter's treehouse was visible from the street. A treehouse." Suddenly, the floodgates opened. For the next 20 minutes, it wasn't about my bamboo anymore. It was about years of pent-up frustration with the HOA's petty tyrannies. People were airing grievances about everything from the approved shades of beige for deck stain to the regulations on holiday decorations. The meeting had turned into a populist uprising, and I was just the guy who had lit the match. The board was stunned into silence. They had expected me to be the villain, but I had inadvertently become a folk hero. They had lost control of their own meeting. Bob, his face bright red, banged the gavel furiously. "Order! This is not the time or place!" But it was too late. The spirit of rebellion was in the air. The meeting ended without a single motion being made against me or my bamboo. They couldn't. They had no legal leg to stand on, and they had just lost the court of public opinion. I walked out of that clubhouse feeling 10 feet tall. I had faced the dragon in its lair and won. But as I passed the front table, Bob leaned in close, his voice a low hiss. "This isn't over," he whispered, his eyes full of cold fury. "We'll find something. We always do." The threat hung in the air, a promise of battles yet to come. The war was far from over. The HOA's defeat at the town hall did not lead to a truce. It led to a change in tactics. Bob's whispered threat was not an empty one. Since they couldn't attack my fortress of bamboo directly, they decided to lay siege to the rest of my life. The HOA's new strategy was simple: death by 1,000 paper cuts. The violation notices started again, but this time they were for infractions so minor, so utterly insignificant, that it was clear they were the product of someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, spending hours staring at my property with a magnifying glass and a copy of the bylaws. The first notice was for my trash cans. The rule stated that receptacles could not be placed at the curb before 6 p.m. the evening before pickup, and must be retrieved by 8 p.m. on the day of pickup. One Tuesday, I got home from work at 8:15 p.m. At 8:17 p.m., an email landed in my inbox. Subject: violation notice. Waste receptacle timeliness. Attached was a time-stamped photo of my trash cans still sitting at the end of my driveway. The fine was $25. A week later, I got another one. Violation notice, lawn height irregularity. The bylaw stated that grass was not to exceed a height of 4 inches. The notice claimed that a review of my front lawn had revealed a patch near the mailbox that was approximately 4.25 inches tall. I was ordered to remedy the situation immediately and fined another $25. I started to wonder if Carol was out there with a ruler. It was psychological warfare. Every time I left my house, I felt like I was being watched. I started doing a full perimeter check before leaving for work. Are the trash cans hidden? Is the hose coiled correctly? Is there a single weed daring to show its face in a flower bed? It was exhausting. The joy I had felt in my private backyard was being slowly eroded by the constant, low-grade harassment at the front. The fines were small, but they were adding up. More than the money, it was the principle of the thing. They were trying to bleed me dry, emotionally and financially. I was spending more time documenting their petty attacks than I was enjoying my home. My Carroll Chronicles binder was now the HOA War Council binder, and it was overflowing. Just when I was starting to feel truly worn down, help arrived from an unexpected quarter. I was out front one Saturday, meticulously trimming the edges of my lawn with a pair of hand shears like a man possessed, when my next-door neighbor on the other side, an elderly widow named Margaret, came over. She was a quiet woman who I'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with. I figured she was coming to complain about the noise, or my increasingly erratic behavior. "Quite a battle you're fighting," she said, her voice soft but clear. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "You have no idea," I sighed, snipping at a defiant blade of grass. "Oh, I think I do," she said with a small smile. "I was on the board, you know, for about 6 months, back in the 90s. I quit when they spent an entire meeting debating the acceptable finish for brass house numbers. I knew then it was a lost cause." I stopped trimming and looked at her. "You're kidding." "Not at all," she said. "I've been watching what they're doing to you. It's harassment, plain and simple. Bob and his cronies get away with it because no one has the time or energy to fight back properly." She paused. "I was a paralegal for 40 years. Mostly contracts and municipal code. If you'd like, I could take a look at your binder. A fresh set of eyes never hurts." I could have hugged her. It was a lifeline. That afternoon, I brought the binder over to her house. She sat me down at her kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and began to go through the pages. She was methodical, silent, her finger tracing the lines of legalese. After an hour, she looked up, her expression grim. "They're being sloppy," she said. "In their rush to get you, they're not following their own procedures. This notice here, it's supposed to be sent via certified mail, not taped to your door. This fine? They didn't give you the mandatory 10-day period to remedy. It's all appealable." She taught me how to fight back. We drafted formal appeals for every single fine, citing the HOA's own procedural rules back at them. We demanded hearings. We buried them in the very same bureaucracy they had been using against me. It was brilliant. The paper war escalated, but now I had an ally. A seasoned, expert ally who knew the enemy's playbook by heart. The stress was still there, but now it was mixed with a renewed sense of purpose. They had pushed me too far, and in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant in a sweet old lady next door. While I was busy fighting a war of words and procedural documents, the bamboo was busy reaching for the sky. It had long since passed the 15-foot mark and was now pushing 20. It was no longer a hedge or a screen. It was a monolith, a towering, living monument to a grudge, and it had started to take on a life of its own. The first sign that the bamboo had transcended its original purpose was the teenagers. I was working from home one afternoon when I heard laughter coming from the front of the house. I peeked through the blinds and saw 3 high school kids on the sidewalk, posing for selfies in front of the bamboo wall, which was now clearly visible from the street. They were making peace signs, framing the shot to make it look like they were deep in some exotic jungle. My spite fence had become an Instagram backdrop. A week later, a local blogger, the kind who writes about quirky neighborhood happenings and new coffee shops, did a feature. The title of the article was The Great Wall of Suburbia. It told a lightly fictionalized version of my story, casting me as a mysterious suburban rebel fighting for his privacy. The article went locally viral. People started driving by my house slowly, pointing at the towering green wall. My house was now a tourist attraction. This, as you can imagine, drove Carol insane. Her goal was to make me a pariah, but instead, my bizarre act of defiance had made me a local legend. The more famous the bamboo became, the more powerless she seemed. The bamboo also changed the ecosystem of my backyard. It created a cool, shaded microclimate on my deck, making it pleasant even on the hottest days. And it brought life. Birds, who had previously ignored my sad little bird feeder, discovered the dense bamboo forest was the perfect place to build nests. My quiet sanctuary was now filled with the sound of chirping and birdsong from dawn till dusk. It was idyllic. It was peaceful. And it was the perfect, final twist of the knife for Carol, who I once overheard complaining to another neighbor about the incessant avian chatter. The best and most unexpected consequence of the bamboo was the effect it had on my other neighbors. The uprising at the town hall had broken the ice. People were no longer afraid to talk to me. In fact, they started to see me as an ally. My neighbor on the other side, a friendly guy named Tom, started having over-the-fence chats with me. Our shared fence, not the one bordering Carol's property. He'd ask for updates on the HOA battle, offering words of encouragement. The family across the street invited me to their 4th of July barbecue. We all stood in their yard, eating hot dogs and looking at my giant wall of bamboo, and they told me their own horror stories about Bob and the Architectural Review Committee. One evening, I hosted a small get-together in my backyard for my newfound friends, Tom and his wife, the family from across the street, and, of course, Margaret, the guest of honor. We sat on my deck, shielded from the world by the rustling green wall, fairy lights twinkling among the bamboo canes. We were a small tribe, a coalition of the reasonable, brought together by a shared enemy and a whole lot of grass. Looking at their smiling faces, hearing their laughter echo in my perfectly private yard, I had a moment of clarity. I had started this whole thing out of anger and frustration, a selfish need to carve out a little piece of the world for myself. But in building my wall, I had accidentally built a bridge. I had created the very thing the HOA was always paying lip service to, but never actually achieved: a community. And it was a community forged in the fires of righteous indignation, which, as far as I was concerned, was the strongest kind of bond there is. The war of petty fines and procedural appeals had reached a stalemate. Margaret and I were successfully swatting away every violation notice they sent, but they showed no signs of giving up. It was a war of attrition, and I knew they were just waiting for me to get tired, to miss a deadline, or to just give up and pay a fine, which they would take as an admission of guilt. Bob and Carol needed a win, and they were getting desperate. Their final gambit arrived via certified mail, a sign that they had learned from Margaret's procedural smackdowns. It was a thick, heavy envelope containing a letter not from the HOA, but from a law firm. Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, or something equally uninspired. It was a formal cease and desist letter. It was 20 pages of glorious, convoluted legalese, but the gist was this: they were accusing my bamboo of violating a little-known county ordinance regarding sightline obstructions for emergency vehicles. They claimed that the height and density of the bamboo at the corner of my property could prevent a fire truck or ambulance from having a clear view as it turned into our cul-de-sac. They were demanding the immediate and total removal of the bamboo down to a height of 4 feet. If I did not comply within 30 days, they would seek a court order and sue me for all legal fees. This was their nuclear option. They had bypassed their own bylaws and gone straight for the county code. My heart sank as I read it. This felt different. This felt real. They had found a weapon that my knowledge of the HOA handbook couldn't counter. I immediately took the letter over to Margaret. She read it slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't say anything for a long time. The silence in her kitchen was deafening. "They're reaching," she finally said, tapping a finger on the page. "This ordinance is real, but it's almost never applied to residential cul-de-sacs. It's meant for commercial intersections. Still, they could tie you up in court for months over it. It would be expensive, even if you won." It felt like a checkmate. They had finally found a way to win. But Margaret wasn't finished. "A legal threat works both ways, Alex," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "They've escalated this outside the bounds of the HOA. That means we can too." For the next week, we didn't focus on the bamboo. We focused on the HOA itself. We went to the county records office. We pulled public permits, property surveys, and architectural plans for every house on the HOA board. We were looking for a chink in their armor, and on Bob's file, we found it. It was beautiful in its simplicity. 10 years ago, Bob had built a large 2-story deck on the back of his house. The permit was there, but the final inspection report was missing. And, according to the property survey, the deck's support columns were built 2 feet inside the 5-foot rear property setback. It was a clear, unambiguous, and much more serious violation of county code than my sightline obstruction. Furthermore, because the deck was a permanent structure, it was also a flagrant violation of the very HOA bylaws he wielded like a holy scepter. We had our counterstrike, we had our coup de grace. The next HOA meeting was their regularly scheduled monthly one, not an emergency session. The agenda was boring: pool maintenance, seasonal planting guidelines. I was not on the agenda, but I went anyway. Margaret came with me. We waited until the new business portion at the end of the meeting. I stood up. "Bob," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I received a letter from the HOA's lawyer regarding a county ordinance. I've been doing some research into the county codes myself. It's fascinating reading." I paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Bob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "For instance," I continued, "I was looking at the county setback requirements and the permit process. Very important for community safety. And I couldn't help but notice that the permit for your own deck, Bob, was never finalized, and that the structure itself appears to be in violation of the 5-foot setback rule. A violation, I might add, that is far more serious than some tall grass. I placed a neat folder on the table in front of him. It contained copies of his own property survey, with the violation highlighted, and the incomplete permit record. You could have heard a pin drop. Carol's jaw was literally hanging open. Bob's face went from pale to beet red in a matter of seconds. The hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see. The man who had terrorized his neighbors over lawn height had a bigger, more illegal structure in his own backyard. He was a king wearing no clothes. I didn't need to say another word. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated the facts. The power dynamic in the room shifted so fast it was almost audible. The lawsuit was dropped the next day. All fines were rescinded. Bob announced his retirement from the HOA presidency a week later, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. A new, more reasonable board was elected in a landslide, led by Tom from across the street. A year has passed. It's a Saturday afternoon, and I'm in my backyard. Barley is snoozing at my feet, dreaming of tennis balls. On the grill, 2 perfect ribeyes are sizzling away. The sun is warm, a cool breeze is blowing, and the only sound is the gentle, soothing rustle of 20-foot-tall bamboo leaves swaying in the wind. The wall stands tall and proud, a lush, green monument to a hard-won peace. I can still hear Carol next door sometimes, her shrill voice complaining about squirrels or the humidity. But now, filtered through the dense foliage, it's just faint, powerless background noise, the distant chatter of a fallen queen in her ever shadier kingdom. I take a sip of my beer and raise the bottle in a silent toast to the towering green canes. They say good fences make good neighbors. Turns out, a 20-foot-tall, legally gray area wall of spite grass makes them even better. It makes them quiet,